what if the entire legacy of faith you've inherited is nothing more than a sophisticated matrix of dogma designed to strip you of your inner strength? Be honest with yourself. Have you ever sat in silent churches, mechanically repeating familiar doctrines, yet deep down, your intuition screams that a colossal piece of truth is being suppressed by conservative elites? The existential emptiness and suffocation you carry isn't a sign of weakness or a loss of faith. It's the echo of a soul desperately seeking escape from a spiritual prison built 2,000 years ago. For centuries, traditional theological systems have instilled in the human mind a perfect mechanism of control. They sow the seeds of original sin, making you believe you were born flawed, that you are an inferior being, needing a clerical intermediary system for salvation. But the harsh truth is that salvation never existed as a favor to be bestowed or bought. When they made you kneel before guilt, they stripped you of humanity's most supreme privilege, the right to connect directly with the creative source without the need for any earthly power. History is not naturally devoid of independent truths. It has been systematically and ruthlessly manipulated. At the 4th century Sanhedrin, a political agreement was established not to protect truth, but to unify the power of the Roman Empire. Texts carrying the light of enlightenment, ancient teachings encouraging self-awareness, were condemned as a threat and ordered to be burned. They were not afraid of distorted myths. They trembled at the prospect that one day you would awaken and realize you were not a blind sheep to be herded by rigid religious laws. Their entire throne of power will crumble the moment you remember who you truly are. This suppression of history has created a colossal void in the spiritual fabric of humanity, banishing billions of souls to exile in their own spiritual homeland. But truth is an entity that cannot be completely destroyed. Beneath the scorching sands of the Egyptian desert, a priceless treasure has patiently awaited the indifference of time for 16 centuries to break this silence. A manuscript containing no threats of hellfire, punishment, or unconditional submission. Instead, it preserves a primal spiritual technology, a code capable of collapsing the entire system of thought control of the Western world. It is the Gospel of Thomas. What is written on those decaying parchment pages is not a new religion, but a spiritual anatomical map that leads you back to your true power. And the most devastating clue to the religious system lies in the very first lines, a code that will forever shatter your understanding of the existence of a supreme being. History is never written by those who seek the truth. History is always shaped by the victors, those who hold the power to determine what you are allowed to believe and what must be buried in oblivion. When we look back at the origins of faith, we are often presented with a perfect picture of purity. But let me tell you a bitter truth. What you call the foundation of traditional theology is actually the remnant of one of the most brutal political purges in human history. Have you ever wondered why, out of hundreds of texts containing the original teachings, only 4 Gospels were chosen to shape the minds of billions of people? It wasn't a random choice or some divine guidance. It was a deliberate selection, a ruthless campaign of stripping away a free spiritual movement into an instrument of authoritarian rule. Let's rewind to the 4th century, an era that marked the collapse of individual power and the rise of a monopolistic religious empire. Before that time, seekers of truth were not bound by any rigid dogma. They gathered in small communities, shared esoteric texts, and believed that each person carried within themselves a divine spark capable of self-enlightenment. But a religion that emphasized self-awareness and inner power was a nightmare for a crumbling Roman Empire. Emperor Constantine, a shrewd ruler, realized that he could not unite a vast empire without a single ideology, a single religion, and most importantly, a single system of control. The Sanhedrin, convened in 325, was not a gathering of enlightened sages. It was a cold-blooded political conference. There, those in power drafted the most sophisticated contract in history, a contract whose price to pay was your own spiritual freedom. If you consider the path to connecting with the Creator as a free river, then the elite who hold the temple gates have built a massive dam and erected toll booths on it. They have decided that you cannot directly drink from that sacred water. You must go through them. They have arrogated to themselves the supreme authority to act as intermediaries, transforming the Supreme Being into a distant, angry entity always demanding tribute. Texts encouraging spiritual autonomy, and teachings affirming that God's kingdom lies within you, are immediately listed as existential threats. Because consider this: if a carpenter, farmer, or a mother could communicate with the divine simply by turning inward and understanding themselves, what meaning would the clerical system have? Who would pay for the salvific rituals? Who would build the magnificent, gilded domes? The throne of mediation will crumble to ashes if this truth is spread. And so, one of the most insidious psychological manipulation weapons was invented: the concept of original sin. Think deeply about this. There is no more perfect form of slavery than making the slave believe they were born sinful. They instill in your mind, from the moment you cry out, that you are a flawed, impure being, forever incapable of standing before the light of your origin without the intervention of the Church. By sowing self-doubt and fear of hellfire, they transform a soul privileged by the Creator into a spiritual beggar, forever bowing and pleading for salvation that rightfully belonged to them from their very first breath. This suppression of history is not merely the concealment of a few parchment scrolls. It is a surgical removal of the most essential part of human consciousness. Let's delve deeper into this psychological machine. When you are convinced that your core nature is sin, your mind automatically forms a defense mechanism based on dependence. This is a form of collective psychological trauma passed down from generation to generation. Try comparing this to how abusers manipulate their victims. The abuser will constantly tell the victim that they are worthless, that they cannot exist without the abuser's protection, and that all punishment is the victim's fault. This is precisely the model that monopolistic religious institutions have applied on a global scale. They transform a supreme being from a source of boundless, all-encompassing, loving energy into a harsh judge, always ready to unleash wrath upon those who disobey. This transformation of the divine image is the most solid foundation upon which to build an empire. That empire is not built of bricks and stones, but of the despair of billions of souls. The architects of this dogmatic matrix made no secret of their intentions. As early as the 2nd century, figures like Lyons Irenaeus began a campaign to smear those possessing enlightened wisdom. He called this intrinsic knowledge spiritual pride, a danger threatening the unity of the community. But the unity he spoke of was actually uniformity in obedience. A flock of sheep is only truly obedient when none dare to seek new pastures on their own. They conflated understanding with blind faith. Original faith was a courageous journey of self-discovery, requiring you to confront your inner darkness to find the light. But the elite transformed it into submission. They told you not to ask, not to search, just to believe what was written after passing through their rigorous censorship system. The consequences of this purge are a bloody picture that mainstream history has always tried to erase. When the Roman emperor ordered the destruction of all texts that did not conform to approved doctrines, A brutal hunt ensued across the continents. Gigantic fires consumed countless priceless manuscripts, turning humanity's greatest intellects into dust scattered by the desert wind. Anyone found in possession of forbidden texts faced exile, torture, or even death. The elites not only wanted to destroy parchment, they wanted to completely wipe out the language of freedom, stripping you of any vocabulary you could use to redefine yourself outside the confines of submission. They wanted to ensure that when you looked in the mirror, you would see only a weak human being in need of guidance, not a brilliant embodiment of the universe. The historical shift from a free spiritual movement to an authoritarian institution has fundamentally altered how humans interact with the divine. In the original model, achieving understanding was an active process, requiring training, reflection, and a deep commitment to inner growth. But in the model of the dogmatic matrix, you are reduced to a passive recipient. Salvation is packaged into dry doctrines, distributed through sacraments administered by clergy. You are no longer a direct participant in your own transformation. You become an observer in your own spiritual journey, entirely dependent on those who claim to represent God on earth. Do you see the ultimate irony here? A religion built on a message of love and liberation is distorted into a machine that produces fear and loyalty. But you must understand a supreme principle of the universe. No system of power, however brutal and sophisticated, can completely extinguish the light of truth. Truth is like water. It always finds the smallest cracks to penetrate the solid stone wall of lies. In the darkest moments of the purge, there were brave men who stood up against the empire's orders. Steadfast monks, silent protectors, decided to gamble their lives to safeguard the flame of enlightenment for future generations. They did not choose to confront the swords of the Roman Empire directly, but rather retreated into the shadows, carrying humanity's most precious treasures hidden deep within Mother Earth. This sacred act of civil disobedience was not merely to save the parchment scrolls. It was an eternal vow that history would not be written solely by tyrants. The legacy of this historical cover-up remains deeply ingrained in the consciousness of modern society. Look around you. Billions of people are still grappling with an invisible sense of guilt, relentlessly judging themselves and others based on moral codes laid down by political councils thousands of years ago. They are trapped in an endless loop of confession, repentance, and continued fear. This manipulation is so subtle that most people don't even realize they are being controlled. They see this spiritual suffocation as an essential part of piety. But this suffocation was never the will of the Creator. It is the design of the elite, who stole your privilege of direct connection and resold it to you at an exorbitant price. By stripping you of the core texts, they have orphaned humanity in its own spiritual home. This is not a baseless conspiracy theory fabricated to undermine the faith. This is a historical truth that has been concealed at all costs. Independent archaeological evidence, in-depth linguistic studies, and objective historical analysis all point to a harsh reality. Original Christianity was far more diverse, rich, and respectful of individual experience than the homogeneous, rigid version we see today. That diversity was stifled not because it was wrong, but because it did not serve the purpose of governance. An empire cannot tolerate individuals capable of independent thought, self-direction, and finding inner peace. A spiritually free individual is a constant threat to any system of control. And that is why they had to build the most impenetrable dogmatic prisons, where the bars were not made of iron, but forged from fear and blind faith. Every matrix has its weaknesses. The biggest weakness of this system is that it constantly relies on your lack of understanding to maintain its power. The moment you stop believing in your own inadequacy, the moment you question the true origins of the doctrines binding you, that impenetrable wall begins to crumble. It's perfectly natural to feel pain upon realizing you've been deceived for so long. That pain is a sign that the barriers of perception are breaking down. You stand at a crossroads in your personal faith history. You can choose to turn away, continuing to embrace the comfortable numbness of empty promises. Or you can choose to confront the darkness of the deception, to reclaim what was taken from your ancestors. The elite's attempts at cover-up seem to have been brilliantly successful for 1,600 years. They brainwashed humanity, burned esoteric texts, and wove a web of lies that enveloped every aspect of spiritual life. The thrones of power in Rome were confident that the secret of human inner strength was forever buried. But history has a bitterly ironic humor toward dictators. The silence of millennia was not the end, but merely a preparation for the most terrifying awakening. Beneath the tranquil sands of a small Egyptian town, the abandoned teachings had patiently waited, unspoiled, unforgotten. A chance discovery in 1945 was about to deliver a fatal blow to the heart of this historical deception, pulling down the final veil and exposing the spiritual weapon that the Church had feared most. Imagine a silence that lasted 1,600 years. A silence not born of nature, but the result of the most brutal purge history has ever witnessed. The Roman Empire and the conservative Vatican elite believed they had won, and they believed the flames of persecution had completely consumed every trace of early Christianity. The texts carrying the light of enlightenment, the great teachings about the inner power of man, all seemed to have turned to ashes and been blown away by the desert wind into nothingness. The throne of mediation was firmly established by fear and indoctrination. But truth is never something that can be permanently buried beneath layers of lies. It is like an eternal seed, patiently nestled in the shadows, waiting for a twist of fate to sprout and shatter the entire structure of a vast power system. The story of humanity's greatest liberation doesn't begin in a grand hall lit by gilded candles, nor does it come from the mouth of a pope in resplendent robes. It begins in December 1945, in a barren and harsh land called Nag Hammadi, in Upper Egypt. An uneducated farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging in the arid soil, searching for natural fertilizer for his small plot of land. Pause for a moment and reflect on this arrangement. The religious system had spent centuries building fortified underground libraries to keep the truth hidden, yet the universe chose a poor farmer, a man who couldn't even read, to unlock the spiritual history of all mankind. His rusty pickaxe struck a hard object beneath the red sand. It was a nearly 1 meter tall earthenware pot, its mouth sealed with tar. Initially, Muhammad Ali hesitated to break the jar. In the mind of a desert dweller, sealed ancient jars were often the holding places of evil spirits or ancient curses. But the greed for a treasure of gold that might be hidden inside overcame his fear. Now he swung his pickaxe and smashed the jar. There was no gold, nor any evil spirit escaped. What spilled from the shattered clay jar were 13 ancient books bound in leather, containing 52 different texts written on papyrus. These were texts written in Coptic, the language of ancient Egypt in the first centuries of the Christian era. The farmer had no idea that, the moment he tore through the tar-covered wrapping, he was also tearing apart a veil that had concealed historical truth for 16 centuries. He inadvertently unearthed the most dangerous psychological weapon against the entire Western system of thought control. How did these priceless treasures end up beneath the desert sands of Nag Hammadi? Why were they so carefully concealed in clay vessels and buried deep underground? The answer takes us back to the 4th century, a dark period when the Roman Empire began tightening its noose around the necks of those seeking truth. In 367, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued a decree ordering the purging of all texts not included in the council's approved doctrinal list. Anyone possessing, copying, or disseminating Gnostic texts was considered an enemy of the Church and faced the most severe punishment. But deep in the desert, early Christian monks in Pachomian monasteries made a decision that required extraordinary courage. They knew these texts were not heresy. They understood that the teachings within contained a divine fire capable of liberating humanity from the slavery of the mind. Instead of obeying the order to throw these parchment scrolls into the church fire, they secretly collected, sorted, or translated them into Coptic, carefully wrapped them in animal skins, and buried them in the desert. The actions of those anonymous monks constituted the greatest act of civil disobedience in spiritual history. Do you recognize the heartbreaking irony here? The defenders of truth were forced to conceal God's teachings from the hands of those who claimed to represent God on earth. They were not fleeing from heretics. They were protecting humanity's heritage from the destruction wrought by the very conservative religious system. Thanks to their silent sacrifice, the seed of truth was preserved through centuries of brutality, through bloody crusades, through periods of bureaucratic heresy, and the rise of dark dogmas, finally emerging at a time when humanity stood on the brink of its deepest crisis of faith. When the papyrus scrolls from Nag Hammadi finally broke through the barriers of antiquities, smugglers, and reached genuine scholars, a shockwave spread throughout the world of history and theology. Radiocarbon dating and paleographic studies confirmed an undeniable truth. These manuscripts were copied between the 3rd and 4th centuries, but their originals may date back to the 1st century, the same period as, or even earlier than, the 4 officially recognized Gospels in the Standard Bible. Even more astonishing, the discovery of fragmented papyrus pieces at Oxyrhynchus a few decades earlier, bearing inscriptions in ancient Greek that perfectly matched the content at Nag Hammadi, proved that these secret teachings were not the product of a select few eccentrics. They were once widespread and shaped the thinking of early Christian communities before being stifled by the political machine of Rome. What was the reaction of the ecclesiastical elite to this discovery? They were not at all pleased to have rediscovered the teachings of the great master. On the contrary, a campaign to discredit and diminish the value of the Nag Hammadi library was immediately launched. They hastily labeled these texts as Gnostic heresy, as aberrant ideas influenced by ancient Greek philosophy, unworthy of the faithful's attention. But independent scholars were not fooled again. They understood that the panic of the ecclesiastical system did not stem from the fact that these texts contained lies, but because they contained a truth so pure, a truth that needed no interpretation or censorship from the clergy. Of the 52 manuscripts found, one shone most brilliantly, a manuscript whose very existence was like a light sword, severing every link in the chain of manipulation. That was the Gospel of Thomas. The opening of this manuscript was like a thunderbolt to traditional theology. These were the secret words spoken by the living Jesus and recorded by Thomas Didymus Judas. Pay attention to every word in this statement. Secret words, living Jesus. No historical context is drawn. No story of the nativity in a manger. No details describing the miracle of turning water into wine. No betrayal by Judas. And what terrified the elites most was that there was not a single word mentioning death on the cross or the resurrection of the body. The entire doctrinal foundation of the Roman Catholic Church is built upon the death of Jesus as a sacrificial atonement for humanity, an external salvation that you must kneel before to receive. But the Gospel of Thomas completely discards that narrative. It presents a completely different picture of the Master's mission. Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas is not a savior who comes to die for your sins. He is a guide, a spiritual scientist, who comes to give you the technology to awaken your deepest inner wisdom. Instead of recounting historical events, this text comprises 114 teachings, or logias, short, concise, and deeply metaphorical sayings designed not to be blindly believed, but to be deciphered by the reader's own awakening. Each logion in the Gospel of Thomas Aquinas is like a code programmed to break through blockages in perception. It's a kind of ancient linguistic technology, directly impacting the subconscious, forcing you to stop searching for answers from the outside world and begin a journey of unearthing your own soul. This manuscript was hunted down and destroyed, not because it was difficult to understand. It was destroyed because it restored ultimate power to each individual. When you hold these teachings in your hands, you are no longer a believer needing to be guided by a hierarchical system. You become a companion on the path to awakening. The discovery of the Gospel of Thomas is not merely finding an ancient artifact in the desert. It is the moment humanity rediscovers the key stolen from its own temple. The suffocation and emptiness you feel in brick and stone churches is not due to a lack of faith, but to your soul's yearning for the primordial light hidden within these forbidden words. Church councils concealed the Gospel of Thomas because it proved their spiritual monopoly to be a great lie. But now, the seal has been broken. The silenced voice of the apostle named Thomas has risen louder than ever, piercing through space and time, to reach souls ready to awaken. But exactly what devastating codes did those 114 secret teachings contain that could strike such terror into a multi-continental empire that it wanted to erase them forever from human memory? As we cross the boundary of obscured historical truths, we begin to penetrate the very core of this taboo heritage. The Gospel of Thomas is not a book of ancient miracles for you to marvel at. It is a code, a sophisticated spiritual technology designed to break through every cognitive filter that the matrix of dogma has imposed on your mind. The elite who held the gates of the temple trembled before this text because they understood its destructive power. Instead of portraying a distant supreme being demanding worship and tribute, the Master in the Gospel of Thomas appears as a scientist of consciousness. He does not demand your kneeling. He gives you codes to perform a self-surgical reassessment of your entire belief system, to awaken the spiritual sovereignty that has been taken from you since birth. When we carefully examine each teaching, or logia, the entire theological structure based on Roman mediation crumbles in large chunks before your eyes. Let's begin with logia number 3, a code of utter destruction for any organization that claims to be the exclusive representative of the divine on earth. The teaching states, if your leaders tell you, "Look, the kingdom is in heaven," then the birds of the air will go before you. If they say the kingdom is in the sea, then the fish will go before you. But the kingdom is within you and outside of you. Let silence envelop you and allow these words to penetrate the shell of your prejudices. For 2,000 years, spiritual rulers have brainwashed us with an incredibly insidious concept. They teach that heaven is a distant physical place, a phantom reward only given after your last breath. And the prerequisite for receiving that ticket is obedience, the purchase of indulgence, participation in rituals under their exclusive control. They imprisoned the Creator behind the walls of the church and arrogated to themselves the right to be ruthless keykeepers. But code number 3 exposed the whole lie. The kingdom is not a destination in the afterlife. It is a state of being, It is the highest frequency vibration flowing through every cell of your being right now. When you realize that the kingdom lies within, the entire manipulative business model based on clerical mediation instantly crumbles. You don't need any earthly authority to grant permission to connect with your source. You are that gateway. Continuing this harsh truth, the second part of Logion 3 delivers a devastating warning about the price of ignorance. When you know yourself, you will be known. But if you don't know yourself, you live in poverty, and you are that poverty. The poverty referred to here has nothing to do with material possessions. It is intellectual impoverishment, the yoke of spiritual slavery, when you meekly surrender your ultimate power to an external belief system. Look back at the bloody history of humanity, where billions of souls have lived and died in this spiritual poverty. They constantly bowed before lifeless wooden statues, weeping and begging an invisible force to bestow the light that burned within their very bones. Conservative elites never want you to know yourself, because an individual who understands their own divine privilege is an individual who cannot be manipulated. They cannot be intimidated by fabricated stories of hellfire, and they absolutely will never bow to dark dogmas. Self-awareness is the death of thought control. The journey of deciphering leads us deeper into Logion number 70, which contains a principle that has the power to completely reverse the traditional concept of salvation. This teaching is like a sharp knife cutting through all ties with deception. If you bring out what is within you, what you bring out will save you. If you do not have it within, what you do not have within will kill you. Do you notice the stark contrast with what you have been forced to believe? Traditional theology has implanted in your mind the notion of original sin, making you believe that your inner nature is an eternal defect, a defilement that can only be cleansed by external rituals performed by the Council of Priests. But the original master asserted the exact opposite. The source of salvation never comes from an external hand sprinkling water called holy water on your forehead. True liberation comes from bravely unearthing and activating the spark of enlightenment already programmed into your spiritual DNA structure. It's not a gift bestowed upon you. It's a biotechnological process waiting to be launched. If you refuse to turn inward, if you allow the fear of the dogmatic matrix to stifle your intuitive voice, that emptiness and repression will slowly gnaw away at, stunt, and destroy your soul's greatest potential. Salvation is an absolute personal responsibility, a self-driven journey that no religious council can undertake for you. Imagine a man who has spent more than half his life kneeling in a majestic synagogue. He obeys every religious law, recites every prayer, yet each night he returns home, an existential suffocation still gripping his chest. He feels like a faint shadow, a sinner awaiting punishment. Until one day, he stumbles upon ancient Coptic script from the Nag Hammadi manuscript. The concept of original sin suddenly shatters like an illusion. A jolt runs down his spine as he realizes that the sophisticated poisons of fear he'd been instilled with for decades were merely tools to keep him under control. The moment he stops begging for mercy from an external judge and begins to embrace his own integrity, the prison without bars crumbles. He is no longer a seeker of faith. He becomes the embodiment of that faith. This story is not an isolated example. It's happening every day, with thousands of people bravely breaking free from the limitations of traditional perceptions. So to completely break free from the confinement of space and form, we must confront Logion number 77. I am the light that shines upon all things. I am all. From me, all emerge, and to me, all converge. Split a log, and I will be there. Turn over a stone, and you will find me there. This language does not belong to any religious institution. This is the language of pure mysticism, describing a primordial network of energy that permeates and encompasses all things. The religious system has tried to confine the sacred, imprisoning it within massive architectural structures, behind gilded altars and crimson velvet curtains. They tell you that the Supreme Being resides only in places they have consecrated. But this teaching shatters that illusion. You don't need to enter a cold, stone building to seek the source. Divine energy is present in all things, in the stillness of nature, in a split log, beneath a rough rock, and most importantly, in the very beat of your heart. You are the most original and ultimate temple. The Church's coercion of humanity to make pilgrimages to specific locations in search of peace is merely a strategy to strip away spiritual freedom, turning faith into a controllable commodity. But perhaps one of the most profound, cognitive challenges to our polarized thinking lies in Logion number 22. When the Master saw the babies nursing, he said, "These babies are like those who enter the kingdom." When his disciples asked how to do so, he replied, "When you make the two into one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make male and female into a single entity, then you will enter the kingdom." This code is not about morality or social rules of conduct. It is describing a state of supreme awakening where the dualistic mind is completely eradicated. Throughout life, the matrix of dogma has taught you how to divide the world. They clearly distinguish between holiness and sin, between light and darkness, between body and soul, between God and man. That division creates an endless inner war, leaving you constantly torn and exhausted. The spiritual technology of the Gospel of Thomas Aquinas requires you to integrate those opposites. The process of making the two into one is the unification of consciousness. It is the shedding of all limitations, prejudices, and labels that society has placed upon you. When you are no longer torn apart by internal contradictions, you attain the wholeness of Christ awareness. The resurrection is not a historical event that happened to a person 2,000 years ago. It is a biological and cognitive transformation taking place right now, along your spine, activating the pineal gland and awakening the light body within you. All these secret teachings point in one direction: the transfer of power from the outside inward. A vast system built on dependence would never tolerate a text encouraging such absolute autonomy. They censored, burned, and called these words the thoughts of the devil, simply because they wanted to maintain an order where you are forever a spiritual orphan, always needing an artificial father in the form of religious institutions. But the truth about your limitless potential has been deciphered. This spiritual technology doesn't need complex rituals. It doesn't need loud pronouncements. It only needs ultimate honesty with yourself and the courage to shed what no longer serves your evolution. Have you ever wondered what kind of entity someone would become if they truly grasped and successfully activated all these codes? What would happen when the flame of enlightenment completely shattered the last vestiges of falsehood? That liberation carried such immense power that it forced the religious system to create one of the most abhorrent smear campaigns in human history, to conceal the identity of an incredibly important figure. A figure holding the final key to this code, whose true identity would forever reshape everything you knew about Christianity. Well, the culmination of this manipulation went beyond simply concealing the teachings. It lay in the fact that they had erased a human being. The journey we have just undertaken is not merely an exploration of forgotten pages of history or rejected texts. It is a profound spiritual surgery, a systematic dismantling of the layers of cognitive filters that the matrix of dogma has skillfully woven into your mind for the past 2,000 years. Allow yourself to sink into absolute stillness right now. Listen to the beat within your chest. Do you feel the vibration of something that is just broken? It is not the collapse of faith, but the shattering of the invisible chains that once bound your soul to the limits of traditional perception. The elite who held the gates of Rome spent centuries building impregnable walls of stone and manipulative doctrines, only to conceal the most brutal truth about their power, the truth that you never needed them. The suffocating emptiness you endured during those years, kneeling beneath the vaulted ceilings of the magnificent cathedral, was not a punishment or a test of faith. It was the voice of your primal intuition, the cry of a God imprisoned in the form of a sinner. They injected into your subconscious the concept of inferiority, making you believe you were born flawed and needed constant atonement through a system of thought control disguised as salvation. But how could an entity bearing the breath of the Creator be a primal sinner? Making you perpetually dependent is the core survival strategy of any ecclesiastical system. If you recognize yourself as a source of light, then those who claim to carry the torch become useless. That is why they hunt down and destroy the Thomas gospel. They feared those 114 spiritual codes not because they were lies, but because they were the sharpest liberating technology ever given to humanity. You are not here by chance, listening to these whispers from the past. Look back at those who have passed by. Millions out there have chosen to turn away, rushing back to the gentle paralysis of lulling doctrines. They would rather be docile sheep in a flock herded by fear than face the storm of awakening. Truth always demands a price too high for everyone to pay. That is the price of the initial solitude, when you realize you no longer belong to the sleepwalking crowd. But if you are still lingering until these final moments, it proves your soul has refused to return to sleep. You are not an aimless rebel. You belong to a group of elite remnants, those who carry within them the genetic code of ancient enlightened wisdom. Your intuition has guided you through the fog of historical deception to reach this ultimate key. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945 was not a random archaeological event. It was a cosmic intervention at a time when humanity was mired in its worst existential crisis. The courageous monks of the 4th century accepted the burial of their treasures beneath the crimson desert sands, not because they surrendered, but because they knew that the seed of truth needed a period of incubation to survive the brutal winter of history. And now, that seed has sprouted within your mind. The code has been activated. The most brilliant teachings of the Master have been unleashed. The kingdom lies neither in distant clouds nor hidden beneath deep oceans. It reigns at the very center of your existence. You are the primordial temple that the Creator chose to reside in. The search for divinity in external places, through artificial rituals and intermediary priests, is now merely a relic of ignorance. The next step on this path doesn't require you to become an enemy of the Church or to loudly denounce old beliefs. True enlightenment always happens in a destructive silence. You simply need to step out of that matrix. When you stop giving your power to the fear of hellfire, when you stop buying peace with outward forms, that whole energy-draining system will automatically lose its effect on you. See the world with new eyes, the eyes of one who has made the two into one. Don't let your polarized mind continue to divide you into fragments of holiness and sin. Embrace your whole being, because even in the darkest corners of your subconscious, the light of Christ awareness is always waiting to be awakened. The greatest resurrection is not the resurrection of a body from the dead, but the rising of a free consciousness from the ashes of submission. At this transitional moment, I invite you to perform a ritual affirming your own spiritual sovereignty. Don't let this newly kindled flame of enlightenment be extinguished by the noise of the outside world. Leave a mark, a silent vow that resonates to the ends of the universe. If you feel a surge of energy running down your spine, if you realize that the final pieces of the historical puzzle have been placed, then go down to the comments and engrave the phrase, "I am awakening." That small act is not to prove anything to anyone, but a pact you make with your own soul, an affirmation that you have officially stepped out of the era of darkness and manipulation. You have reclaimed your ultimate privilege. Please subscribe to the channel not for the mindless algorithms of the digital age, but as a way to keep the door to truth wide open before you. Each video, each manuscript deciphered in the future will continue to be a tool to further sharpen your perception. Together, we are rebuilding a sanctuary without walls, without religious laws, where each individual is a supreme priest in their own inner universe. The journey to unravel historical secrets is still very long. What the Vatican hid in its underground vaults is not limited to the teachings of the Apostle Thomas. There are still earth-shattering secrets about the true identity of Mary Magdalene, about stolen vibrational technologies, and about the true origins of humankind, waiting to be brought to light. But for today, let true peace fill the voids left by deception. You are no longer entangled in the web of dark dogmas. You know who you are, where you come from, and the immense power you possess. May the flame of self-awareness burn brightly within you, illuminating every step you take through the labyrinth of this physical world. Never forget that you are not a flawed creature yearning for salvation. You are salvation. The truth has been given to you, and power now rests entirely in your hands. The future of human consciousness will not be shaped by religious councils or imperial decrees, but will be written by individuals carrying within them the light of primordial wisdom, just like you. The journey of the awakened has only just begun.